The engines screamed. Captain Marcus Bennett felt the helicopter shudder violently as the RPG exploded through its tail rotor. Metal screamed, alarms wailed, and in that instant, 32-year-old Captain Bennett of the United States Army knew they were going down. Hard. In the middle of Taliban country. 12 miles from the nearest friendly position. The next 72 hours would call everything these four men believed about survival, sacrifice, and leaving no one behind into question. Well, before I get into the actual tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button. You're going to want to see the ending. It began on a Tuesday morning in March, the year 2011. Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Captain Marcus Bennett had 8 years' experience piloting his Black Hawk helicopters for the Army's 101st Airborne Division. 212 missions under his belt. Extraction, supply, medevacs, he'd done it all. This mission would be no different. Bennett had woken that morning at 0500 hours, same as every day. The routine was comforting in a war zone where nothing else was predictable. Coffee from the mess hall, bitter and overbrewed but hot. Equipment check in the hangar, walk around the bird, run his hands over the airframe, talk to the crew chief about the overnight maintenance. These rituals kept him grounded, literally and figuratively. At 32, Bennett was one of the older pilots in the unit. Most of the guys flying Blackhawks were in their mid-20s, fresh from flight school, eager to prove themselves. Bennett had been doing this since he was 24. 8 years of Afghanistan, Iraq, and everywhere else the Army needed helicopters. 8 years of watching young soldiers climb into his bird and hoping to God he'd get them all home alive. The briefing at 0600 hours had been straightforward. A small patrol had encountered heavy resistance near a village called Marja. 3 wounded Marines needed immediate extraction. Bennett's crew, First Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell as co-pilot, Staff Sergeant Tyler Anderson on the door gun, and Specialist Jake Roberts as the medic, had done this dance dozens of times before. Ryan Mitchell was 28 from Colorado, married with a 2-year-old daughter he talked about constantly. He kept her picture taped to the instrument panel, a little blonde girl with her mother's smile. Mitchell was a good pilot, steady hands and sharp instincts. He'd save the joking for after missions, but during flights, he was all business. Tyler Anderson was the youngest of the crew at 24, a door gunner from rural Alabama who'd grown up hunting and could put rounds on target like he'd been born with a machine gun in his hands. Anderson had that southern drawl that got thicker when he was stressed, and a dry sense of humor that kept everyone sane during the worst days. Jake Roberts was 26 from New Jersey, a combat medic who'd been with the unit for 3 years. Quiet, methodical, the kind of guy who could keep his hands steady and his voice calm while working on a soldier whose blood was everywhere. Roberts had saved more lives than anyone could count. The crews called him Doc and trusted him with everything. Weather's clear, enemy activity moderate, the intelligence officer had said, pointing at the map. Get in, get them out, 15 minutes max. The intelligence officer was a captain, younger than Bennett, someone who'd never left the wire, never heard the sound of bullets hitting your bird's fuselage. He said moderate, like it meant something predictable. In Bennett's experience, moderate in Afghanistan meant anywhere from sporadic sniper fire to full-scale ambush. You never knew until you were in it. "What's the ground situation?" Bennett had asked, studying the map. The village of Marja was a known Taliban stronghold. Taking a bird in there was like sticking your hand in a hornet's nest. Marine Patrol took contact during a routine sweep. 3 wounded, 2 serious. They're pinned down about 200 meters from the LZ. Ground unit will suppress while you extract. Bennett had nodded, but his gut was already telling him this wasn't going to be simple. Nothing involving Marja ever was. The village had changed hands 3 times in the past year. The Taliban controlled it at night, coalition forces during the day, maybe. The locals just tried to survive. "Rules of engagement?" Mitchell had asked. "Standard. Return fire as needed. Try to avoid civilian casualties." The intelligence officer had said it like it was easy, like they could somehow know which figure in the distance was a farmer and which was a fighter until bullets started flying. After the briefing, the crew had walked to the flight line in silence, each man lost in his own pre-mission ritual. Anderson had checked his M240 again, running his hands over the feed tray, checking the barrel, making sure every belt link was seated properly. Mitchell had reviewed the approach vectors one more time on his kneeboard. Roberts had inventoried his medical kit, tourniquets, chest seals, morphine, all the things you needed when young men got holes punched in them. Bennett had done what he always did. Walked around the Black Hawk one more time, checking every panel, every rotor blade, every part of the machine that was going to keep them alive. The crew chief had already signed off on the pre-flight, but Bennett needed to see it himself, touch it himself. It was superstition maybe, but 8 years of flying in combat zones taught you that attention to detail kept you breathing. The Black Hawk sat on the tarmac like a predator at rest, all angles and purpose. 70 feet long, 16,000 pounds of rotor blades, turbine engines, an armored crew compartment. Bennett had read somewhere that Black Hawks had been in service since the 1970s. Proven design. Reliable. But even reliable machines failed when someone put an RPG into them. Bennett had nodded. Mitchell had cracked a joke about being home in time for lunch. Anderson had checked his M240 machine gun for the third time that morning. Roberts had organized his medical kit with the quiet efficiency that came from treating too many gunshot wounds in too many landing zones. They'd lifted off at 0730, the Afghan sun already turning the sky from pink to brutal white. The Black Hawk cut through the morning air like a blade, its rotors beating a rhythm Bennett could feel in his bones. Below, the landscape scrolled past. Brown mountains, green valleys, scattered compounds where civilians tried to live normal lives in the middle of a war zone. The flight out was smooth. Too smooth. Bennett had learned to distrust easy missions. The ones that looked simple on paper were always the ones that went sideways. Murphy's Law was written in blood in Afghanistan. Through his helmet, Bennett could hear the radio chatter from other aircraft in the area, a pair of F-16 running combat air patrol to the north, a Predator drone orbiting somewhere overhead, other helicopters moving supplies and personnel across the province. It was a ballet of controlled chaos, everyone trying to accomplish their mission without running into each other or getting shot down. Bennett checked his instruments out of habit. Fuel good. Engine temps normal. Hydraulics holding steady. Mitchell was handling the navigation, cross-referencing GPS with the terrain below. Anderson and the opposite door gunner scanned their sectors, weapons ready but not firing. Roberts sat near the medical gear, calm and focused, already mentally preparing for whatever injuries he'd be treating. The landscape below told the story of Afghanistan, ancient and modern warfare colliding. There were villages that looked like they hadn't changed in 1,000 years, mud brick compounds clustered around wells and fields worked by hand. And scattered among them, the debris of modern conflict, burned out Soviet tanks from the 80s, impact craters from recent airstrikes, the blackened shells of buildings destroyed in firefights. 10 minutes out, Mitchell called through the headset. Bennett's hands tightened slightly on the controls. 10 minutes to the LZ, the Marines were counting on them. Young men bleeding out in the dirt, waiting for that beautiful sound of rotor blades that meant someone was coming to get them out. Bennett had done this hundreds of times, but it never got routine. Every mission was someone's life on the line. The terrain below shifted from green valleys to more arid ground. This was the approach to Marja. Farmland mixed with compounds, irrigation ditches cutting geometric patterns through fields. From altitude, it looked peaceful. But Bennett knew better. He'd extracted too many casualties from this area to think of it as anything but deadly. 5 minutes, Mitchell updated. Roger. Door gunners, weapons free. Anything that shoots at us, light it up. Copy, Anderson responded, his Alabama drawl tight with concentration. The Black Hawk dropped lower, transitioning from cruise to tactical approach. Bennett could see the compounds now, individual buildings becoming distinct. Somewhere down there, 3 Marines were waiting, bleeding, hoping the helicopter would get to them before the Taliban did. 15 minutes out, Mitchell called through the headset. Bennett adjusted their approach vector. The landing zone was supposed to be cold, secured by ground forces, but in Afghanistan, supposed to be didn't mean much. The Taliban had a nasty habit of letting you think everything was fine right up until it wasn't. "Door gunners, eyes open," Bennett ordered. Anderson shifted in his harness, scanning the terrain through his weapon's optics. On the opposite side, another gunner did the same. Robert sat near the medical supplies, ready to move the moment they touched down. The radio crackled. "Nighthawk 2-7, this is ground unit actual. LZ is hot. Repeat, LZ is hot. Multiple contacts, northeast side of the compound. We're taking fire." Bennett's jaw tightened. Hot landing zone meant they'd be sitting ducks during the extraction, but those Marines were counting on them. "Copy that, ground actual. We're coming in fast. Have your wounded ready to move." He pushed the cyclic forward, dropping altitude. The Black Hawk descended toward the compound, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by low walls and struggling fields. Bennett could see muzzle flashes now, small bursts of light from the tree line to the northeast. The ground unit was pinned down. "Anderson, suppressing fire on that tree line," Bennett ordered. The door gun opened up, the heavy staccato of the M240 vibrating through the airframe. Tracers arced down toward the enemy position. On the opposite side, the other gunner joined in, creating a curtain of fire. 50 meters, Mitchell called out, handling the navigation while Bennett focused on the approach. The helicopter descended into the landing zone, dust billowing up around them. Through the brown cloud, Bennett saw Marines running toward them, 2 carrying a third between them. Roberts was already moving, one hand on his kit, ready to grab the wounded. That's when Bennett saw it. A figure in the tree line, shouldering a tube. "RPG!" he shouted, but the rocket was already in the air. The world turned into fire and noise. The explosion hit the tail rotor assembly, tearing through hydraulics and control surfaces. The Black Hawk lurched violently to the right. Alarms screamed, warning lights flooded the cockpit like a Christmas tree from hell. "We're hit! We're hit!" Mitchell's voice was tight with controlled panic. Bennett fought the controls, but the helicopter was dying under his hands. Without the tail rotor, they had no directional control. The Black Hawk began to spin, slowly at first, then faster. The ground rushed up to meet them. "Brace for impact!" Bennett shouted. Training took over. Bennett cut the throttle, trying to auto-rotate, to use the main rotor's momentum to slow their descent. But they were too low, spinning too fast. The ground was right there. The Black Hawk hit hard. The landing skids crumpled. The fuselage scraped across rocky earth, throwing up a storm of dust and debris. Metal screamed, glass shattered. Bennett's head slammed against the side of his helmet despite the harness holding him in place. The world became a chaos of noise and violent motion. Then, suddenly, silence. Except for the ringing in Bennett's ears and the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal. "Sound off," Bennett croaked, tasting blood. "Mitchell here. I'm okay. Head hurts like hell." Anderson, bruised but breathing. A long pause. Too long. "Roberts!" Bennett shouted, fumbling with his harness release. "Here." The medic's voice was strained. "Legs pinned. Can't move." Bennett finally got his harness open and pulled himself from the pilot's seat. His left shoulder screamed in protest. Dislocated or broken, he couldn't tell. The cockpit was a disaster of cracked instruments and hanging wires. He squeezed past Mitchell, who was already climbing out, and made his way to the cargo bay. The Black Hawk had come to rest, tilted on its side. Equipment and supplies had been thrown everywhere. Roberts was trapped under a section of bulkhead that had torn loose in the crash. The medic's face was pale, jaw clenched against the pain. "Get him out," Bennett ordered. Mitchell and Anderson joined him, and together they lifted the twisted metal. Roberts gasped as the pressure released, then bit back a scream as they pulled him clear. His right leg was badly broken. Bennett could see the unnatural angle even through the combat pants. "Check the radio," Bennett told Mitchell, while Anderson helped Roberts to a more stable position. "We need an emergency beacon going." Mitchell climbed back toward the cockpit, then returned shaking his head. "Radio's dead. Took shrapnel in the crash. Emergency beacon's not transmitting." Bennett felt his stomach drop. No radio meant no way to call for help. No beacon meant no one knew exactly where they were, and they were sitting in a downed helicopter in enemy territory. "Weapons and supplies," Bennett ordered, pushing down the fear. "Everything we can carry. We can't stay with the bird." The truth was brutal. A downed helicopter was a beacon for every Taliban fighter within miles. They had maybe 20 minutes before this place became a killing ground. They worked fast. Anderson grabbed his M240 and all the ammunition belts he could find. Bennett retrieved their M4 carbines and every magazine he could carry with his good arm. Mitchell gathered what was left of the medical supplies and water. Roberts, pale and sweating despite the pain medication Mitchell had injected him with, directed them to the most critical items from his kit. "Can you walk?" Bennett asked Roberts. The medic tried to stand, collapsed immediately. "Negative, not without help." Anderson knelt beside him. "I've got you, Doc. We're not leaving you behind." "Actually," Roberts said, his voice tight with pain, "that's exactly what you should do." "Not happening," Bennett cut him off. "We all go or nobody goes." "Sir, I'll slow you down. With my leg like this, you're talking maybe half a mile an hour. The Taliban will catch us in an hour, maybe less." "Then we better get moving now instead of arguing," Bennett said. His tone made it clear the discussion was over. They rigged a hasty litter using cargo netting and whatever rigid poles they could salvage. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep Roberts off his shattered leg. Anderson and Mitchell took the front and back, with Bennett watching their six despite his injured shoulder. They set off northeast, away from the crash site, and toward where Bennett remembered seeing rocky terrain on the approach, caves and ridges where they might find cover. Behind them, the Black Hawk lay broken on the Afghan dirt, a testament to how fast everything could go wrong. The afternoon sun was merciless. Within an hour they were all soaking in sweat. The terrain was unforgiving. Loose rocks that shifted underfoot, steep ravines cutting across their path, thorny scrub that tore at their uniforms. And every 50 yards they had to stop to rest, giving Mitchell and Anderson a break from carrying Roberts. Bennett's shoulder was getting worse. Every step sent fire through the joint. He'd probably torn the rotator cuff when they crashed, maybe dislocated it completely. But he couldn't afford to think about it now. Pain was just information. The body telling you it was damaged. You could ignore information if you had to. Mitchell and Anderson were taking turns at the front and back of the litter, switching positions every 100 yards or so. Carrying a grown man across broken terrain was exhausting work. Roberts wasn't a big guy, maybe 170 soaking wet, but in combat gear with all his equipment he was pushing 220. And that was dead weight, nothing Roberts could do to help shift or balance. "How far do you think we've gone?" Mitchell asked during one rest stop, breathing hard. His face was flushed, sweat pouring down from under his helmet. Bennett checked his compass and what he could see of the terrain. "Maybe a mile." "Not enough. At this rate, we'll make 3 miles before dark, maybe 4 if we push hard." "Then we push hard." Bennett scanned their back trail with his rifle scope. What he saw made his blood cold. Behind them, he could see smoke rising from the crash site, and worse, he could see figures moving toward it. A lot of figures. Even at this distance, he could count at least 15, maybe 20. And there were vehicles on the roads, pickups and motorcycles spreading out in search patterns. "Contact rear," Bennett said quietly. "At least 20, maybe more. They've found the bird." Anderson cursed softly. "How long before they track us?" "Not long. We're leaving a trail a blind man could follow." Bennett gestured at the disturbed ground, the broken branches, the marks from the litter being dragged. They might as well have painted arrows pointing their direction. Robert spoke up from the litter, his voice strained but determined. "There's a village about 3 miles northeast of where we went down. I saw it during our approach. If we can make it there—" "That's Taliban country," Mitchell interrupted. "We'd be trading one death for another." "Maybe," Robert said. "Or maybe we find someone willing to help. Not everyone in Afghanistan wants us dead." It was a hell of a gamble, but looking at the line of fighters spreading out from the crash site, Bennett realized they didn't have many options. They could try to hide in the rocks and hope the rescue teams found them before the Taliban did. Or they could take a chance on Afghan hospitality. Bennett had been in Afghanistan long enough to know the reality. Yes, the Taliban controlled large areas. Yes, many Afghans resented the American presence. But there were also families who remembered the schools we'd built, the clinics we'd staffed, the Taliban brutality we'd fought against. Some Afghans helped because they believed in something better. Some helped because they hated the Taliban more than they feared them. "We head for the village," Bennett decided, "but we stay hidden. Watch it first. If it looks wrong, we bypass and keep moving." They pushed on. The sun tracked across the sky, turning from white to gold to blood red. Every step was agony. Bennett's shoulder was on fire, but he kept scanning their back trail, kept watching for pursuit. Behind them, he could see dust rising, vehicles moving along the roads, fighters spreading out in search patterns. It was like watching a net close, slowly but inevitably. Mitchell and Anderson were starting to struggle. Carrying Roberts in the heat across this terrain was breaking them down. Their rest stops became more frequent, their breathing harder. But neither man complained. That wasn't how this worked. You didn't quit on your crew. Roberts was the worst off. Despite the morphine Mitchell had given him, the medic's face was gray with pain. Every jolt of the litter sent agony through his shattered leg. Sweat soaked his uniform. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration despite regular water breaks. But when Bennett asked if he needed to stop, Roberts just shook his head. "Keep moving, sir. They're getting closer." He was right. The Taliban's search parties were more visible now. Bennett could see them through his scope. Armed men moving through the rocks, checking wadis and caves, systematically clearing the area around the crash site. They were professionals, experienced fighters who knew their territory. And they were getting closer. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, they'd made maybe 3 miles. Every muscle in Bennett's body was screaming. His shoulder felt like someone was driving nails into it. But they were still moving, still ahead of the pursuit. Barely. The village Roberts had spotted came into view as they crested a ridge, a small collection of compounds surrounding a dried-up stream bed. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. Children's voices carried on the evening air. "Looks quiet," Mitchell observed, studying the village through his scope. "Too quiet," Anderson countered. "Where are the military-age males? I see kids and women, but no men." He was right. Bennett studied the village through his scope, doing a systematic sweep of every compound, every street, every visible doorway. Something was off about it. The way the women moved quickly between buildings, heads down, avoiding open spaces. The way the children stayed close to walls instead of playing in the open. This was a place that had learned to be afraid. "Taliban have been here," Roberts said from his litter. "Recently, from the looks of it." Bennett recognized the signs. He'd seen it in other villages, the fear that hung in the air like smoke. Taliban control wasn't subtle. It was enforced through violence, through public punishment, through the kind of terror that made people choose silence over resistance. Helping Americans in a place like this wasn't just dangerous, it was likely fatal. But they were out of options. Behind them, the Taliban search parties were closing in. Ahead was this village and the slim chance that someone might help. Beyond the village was open desert and more Taliban territory. They were trapped, and they all knew it. Bennett made a decision. "We wait until full dark, then approached that compound on the southeast edge. Looks like a family compound. Good sightlines, walls we can defend if we need to. They spent the remaining daylight on the ridge, watching. Bennett used his scope to study every detail of the village. He counted the compounds, 12 in total. Watched the patterns of movement, women going to the well, children running errands, the occasional elderly man visible briefly before disappearing back inside. No young men, no military-age males anywhere to be seen. That meant either the Taliban had recruited them all, killed them all, or they were in hiding. As darkness fell, they moved down from the ridge. Bennett led, his M4 up and ready, scanning for threats with every step. Mitchell and Anderson carried Roberts between them, moving as quietly as possible despite the awkward wait. Every sound seemed magnified in the night, their boots crunching on gravel, their breathing heavy in the still air, the occasional pop of distant gunfire from some other firefight miles away. The village at night was different. Darker than anything back home. No streetlights, no electric glow from windows. Just the occasional flicker of oil lamps or candles through gaps in walls. It felt like stepping back in time, into a world that existed long before electricity or modern warfare. They reached the compound wall. Bennett pressed against the sun-warmed mud brick, listening. Inside, he could hear voices, women talking in Pashto, a child crying, the normal sounds of evening in an Afghan home. Somewhere, a radio played traditional music, faint and tinny. These were people, just people, trying to live their lives in the middle of a war they probably never asked for. Bennett took a breath, then knocked on the wooden gate. The voices inside stopped immediately, the music cut off. Footsteps approached the gate, cautious, hesitant. A man's voice called out in Pashto, demanding to know who was there. Bennett could hear the fear in his voice, the tension. A knock on the door after dark in Taliban country meant trouble, always. Bennett spoke the few words of Pashto he knew. American, wounded, need help. His pronunciation was terrible, but the message was clear enough. Silence. Then more footsteps and whispered conversation. Bennett could hear the debate happening inside, urgent, intense, probably about whether opening this gate was suicide. He wouldn't have blamed them for saying no. He wouldn't have blamed them for shooting through the gate. They had every reason to be afraid. The gate cracked open, revealing an older man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much violence. He had to be in his 60s, maybe older. His face deeply lined, his hands weathered from hard work. Behind him stood two women, one middle-aged, one younger, probably his wife and daughter. Several children peered around them, wide-eyed and curious despite the fear. The old man looked at Bennett, at Mitchell and Anderson supporting the litter with Roberts on it, at their weapons and uniforms. His eyes moved from face to face, taking it all in, making calculations that would determine whether his family lived or died. Bennett kept his M4 pointed at the ground, non-threatening but unready. He was asking this man to risk everything. The least he could do was be honest about what they were. Finally, the old man spoke in broken English, each word carefully chosen. Taliban. Come here yesterday. Say anyone help Americans, they kill whole family. He paused, his gaze moving from Bennett to Roberts, focusing on the medic's gray face and the unnatural angle of his leg. But you have wounded man. This is not right to turn away. In that moment, Bennett understood. This wasn't politics or ideology. This was something older, something that transcended war. The obligation to help the wounded, the duty to show mercy. Whatever this man thought about Americans or the war or anything else, he was looking at an injured human being, and that was enough. He opened the gate wider. Come, fast, before someone see. They moved into the compound's courtyard. The old man, his name was Amir, directed them to a storage room built against the back wall. His oldest daughter brought blankets and water. The women quickly set about examining Roberts's leg, making soft, concerned sounds as they worked. "I am Doctor," Amir explained, kneeling beside Roberts with a practiced ease that spoke of years of medical training. "Was Doctor, in Kabul, before Taliban first time." His hands moved over Roberts's leg with professional certainty, probing gently, feeling for the extent of the damage. "I work at main hospital, surgery. Then Taliban come in 1996. Say women cannot have male doctor. Say men cannot have female doctor. Say medicine is Western corruption." He shook his head, his face bitter with old memories. "They close hospital. They burn books. They beat doctors who try to work. So I come here, to my family's village. I do what I can, but without equipment, without medicine." He gestured helplessly. "Mostly, I watch people die from things that should be easy to fix." Bennett watched as Amir continued his examination of Robert's leg. Despite his age, despite the primitive conditions, the old doctor's movements were confident and skilled. This was a man who'd saved lives in proper hospitals with proper equipment. Now he was reduced to working by lamplight in a storage room with whatever supplies he could scroungage. "Bone is broken bad," Amir said finally, meeting Roberts's eyes. "Tibia and fibula both. Compound fracture. Without surgery, without proper fixation, you maybe lose leg, maybe develop an infection and lose more than leg." He paused. "I have seen this many times. Always same result, without hospital." Roberts's face went even paler. "Can you stabilize it? Enough to get me out of here?" Amir nodded slowly. "I do what I can, but you cannot stay long. Taliban come back. Check villages. Make sure no American soldiers hiding." He met Bennett's eyes. "They find you here. They kill everyone. My daughters, my grandchildren, everyone. They make example." "How long do we have?" Mitchell asked. "Maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight. They patrol but no schedule, when they feel like it. Sometimes dawn, sometimes middle of night. No pattern." Amir stood, moving to a small cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a wooden box, opened it to reveal medical supplies, old, worn, but carefully maintained. "This is all I have. Some antibiotics from before, some pain medicine. Bandages I make myself." Bennett watched as Amir worked, assisted by his daughter, a woman maybe 30 years old who moved with the same professional confidence as her father. She had clearly learned medicine from him, probably the only way she could after the Taliban banned female doctors. Together, they cleaned Roberts's wound, set the bone as best they could with improvised splints made from wooden boards and torn cloth, and wrapped it tightly. Roberts gritted his teeth through the procedure, refusing to make a sound despite the agony. Only when it was done did he let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you," he said to Amir. "You didn't have to help us." "Yes, I did," Amir replied simply. "I am doctor. Is my duty." He cleaned his hands in a basin of water his daughter brought. "But now we have problem. You need hospital, real hospital, American hospital. This," he gestured at the improvised splint, "this only buy time. Maybe 2 days, maybe 3. Then infection comes, or bone heals wrong, or blood flow stops. You understand?" Bennett's mind raced. They needed time for Roberts's leg to be treated. They needed a way to contact their base. And they needed a miracle. "Do you have radio?" he asked Amir. "Cell phone? Any way to communicate?" The old man shook his head. "Taliban take all phones, all radios. Only they have." Anderson spoke up. "What about the Taliban? When they come, what do they use for communication?" Amir's eyes narrowed in understanding. They have radios, handheld ones, and motorcycles, sometimes with radios too. An idea was forming in Bennett's mind. Desperate, crazy, probably suicidal, but an idea. When do the Taliban patrols usually come through? Usually dawn. They check each house. Make sure no one hiding anything. Bennett checked his watch. They had maybe 6 hours. He looked at his men, Mitchell checking his weapon, Anderson standing guard by the door, Roberts being tended to by Amir and his daughter. They'd all volunteered for this. They all knew the risks, but asking them for what he was about to ask felt like a line he'd never wanted to cross. "We need that radio," Bennett said quietly, "which means we need to take it from a Taliban patrol." The room went still. Mitchell looked up from his M4, eyes widening. Anderson turned from the door. Even Roberts, gray with pain, focused on Bennett. "You're talking about an ambush," Mitchell said. "In the middle of a village. That'll bring every fighter in the area down on us." "I'm talking about getting out of here alive," Bennett countered. "Without a radio, we're dead. Sooner or later, they'll find us. At least this way, we control the when and where." "And risk these people's lives," Anderson added, gesturing to Amir and his family. "They're already at risk just having us here," Bennett said. The truth was brutal, but inescapable. The moment that gate opened, they made their choice. Now we make ours. We can wait here and hope for rescue that might not come. Or we can take the fight to them. Robert spoke up, his voice weak but determined. "I'm dead weight. You know it. I know it. Without me, you could move fast, maybe make it to friendly lines. With me." He trailed off, the implication clear. "Roberts," Bennett said firmly, "your crew. We don't leave crew behind, ever. We're all getting out of here, or none of us are." Amir had been listening quietly. Now he spoke. "I help. I know village. Know where Taliban patrol. Know best place for, what you say, ambush." "You'd be signing your death warrant," Bennett said. "If they figure out you helped us, they already kill me someday," Amir interrupted. "I am old doctor who worked with Americans before. They do not forget these things. They do not forgive." He stood, his shoulders straight despite his years. "Better to die fighting than waiting." The plan came together over the next 2 hours. Amir's knowledge of the village layout was invaluable. He showed them where the Taliban typically parked their motorcycles when they stopped to search houses, showed them the narrow alley that would give them cover and concealment, explained the patrol patterns he'd observed over the past months. "Usually 4 men, Amir said, drawing in the dirt of the courtyard floor with a stick. His diagram was surprisingly detailed. Every building, every alley, every potential firing position marked out. 2 on motorcycles, 2 on foot. The ones on foot, they do searching. The ones on motorcycles, they watch. They are smart. They learn from fighting Americans. They know tactics now." Bennett studied the diagram, his tactical mind already working through the problem. 4 enemies. 2 with vehicles and radios. 2 on foot conducting searches. The motorcycles were the key. Take them out first, grab the radios, and they had a chance. Let even one of them get away, and every Taliban fighter in the province would descend on this village. "Where exactly do they stop?" Bennett asked, pointing at the diagram. Amir tapped a spot near the village well. "Here, always here. They get water, they smoke. They make women bring them food sometimes. They act like they own village, like we are their servants." Mitchell leaned in, studying the layout. "That alley there," he pointed, "gives us a perfect angle. We can hit them from cover, grab the radios, and be gone before the foot patrol knows what happened." "If everything goes perfect," Anderson added. "But when does anything go perfect?" He had a point. In combat, plans were just starting points. The enemy had a vote. Circumstances changed, weapons jammed, people made mistakes. The Taliban had been fighting in Afghanistan for decades. They weren't going to be easy targets. Motorcycles first, Bennett decided. Take them out quiet if we can. Suppressors on our M4s, 3-round bursts. Anderson, you hold with the M240 as backup in case things get loud. Mitchell and I take the shots. What about me? Roberts asked from where he lay on the blankets. His face was still gray with pain despite Amir's ministrations, but his eyes were alert. You stay here. Guard this compound. If things go wrong, you protect Amir's family. Roberts started to protest, but Bennett cut him off. That's an order, specialist. These people risked everything for us. If the Taliban come here while we're gone, someone needs to be here to fight. That's you. The medic nodded reluctantly, accepting the logic, even if he hated being left behind. Amir spoke up. I come with you. I know village. I know which families will hide, which might call Taliban. I know safe paths, quiet paths. You've done enough, Bennett said. More than enough. We can't ask you to. You do not ask, Amir interrupted, his voice firm. I tell you, this is my choice. He stood, his shoulders straight despite his years. Taliban kill me someday anyway. I work with Americans before. I treat their wounded. I speak their language. They do not forget these things. They do not forgive. So better to die doing something right than waiting for them to decide my time has come. Bennett looked at the old doctor, at the determination in his eyes, the set of his jaw. This wasn't bravado or foolishness. This was a man who'd made his peace with death and chosen to face it on his own terms. How could Bennett argue with that? All right, Bennett said finally. But you stay back. You guide us in, show us the positions, then you fall back to cover. We take the shots. Clear? Amir nodded. Clear. They spent the next hour preparing. Bennett and Mitchell checked their weapons meticulously, cleared them, checked the suppressors, loaded fresh magazines, verified their sights were still zeroed. Anderson positioned himself where he'd have good overwatch of the whole operation, the M240 ready to lay down suppressive fire if needed. Roberts, despite his broken leg, helped where he could. He redistributed their remaining ammunition, making sure everyone had full combat loads. He checked their first aid kits, made sure everyone had tourniquets accessible. If someone got hit, every second would count. Amir's daughter brought them food, flatbread and some kind of stew. It was the first hot meal they'd had since the crash, and they ate quickly, efficiently, fuel for what was coming. The women watched them with a mixture of fear and something else. Maybe respect, maybe just resignation. They knew what was about to happen. They knew their lives hung in the balance. As they ate, Bennett found himself thinking about Mitchell's daughter back home, about Anderson's mother in Alabama, about Roberts's family in New Jersey, about all the people who loved these men and had no idea that right now, in a mud brick compound in Afghanistan, they were preparing for a desperate gamble that could leave them all dead. But that was the job. That was what they'd signed up for. And right now, 4 American soldiers and 1 Afghan doctor were all that stood between survival and death. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they heard the motorcycles. Bennett, Mitchell, and Anderson were in position in the alley Amir had showed them, a narrow passage between 2 compound walls that gave them a perfect angle on where the patrol always stopped. Roberts was back at Amir's compound with Amir's daughter watching over him, an M4 in his lap in case things went wrong. The motorcycles rolled into view, 2 riders just as Amir had predicted. They stopped near a well in the center of the village. The riders dismounted, rifles slung over their shoulders, talking casually. One lit a cigarette. They were confident, relaxed. This was their territory. They owned it. That confidence was about to be their last mistake. Bennett gave the signal. Anderson took the rider on the left with a 3-round burst so quiet it sounded like coughs in the pre-dawn stillness. Suppressed weapons were one advantage of being U.S. military. Mitchell dropped the rider on the right half a second later. Both Taliban fighters crumpled to the dirt before their brains could register they were hit. "Move," Bennett hissed. They sprinted from the alley. Anderson grabbed one of the radios from a fallen fighter. Mitchell took the other. They were back in the alley and moving before the 2 foot patrol Taliban even registered something had happened. But then a child screamed, a woman shouted, and the foot patrol came running. "Contact front!" Anderson called, swinging his M240 up. The Taliban fighters rounded a corner, rifles rising. Anderson cut loose, the heavy machine gun roaring in the confined space. Mud exploded from walls. One fighter went down, then the other. But not before one of them had keyed his radio, shouting in Pashto. "They called it in," Mitchell said, his face grim. "We got about 5 minutes before this place is crawling with hostiles." Bennett grabbed one of the captured radios and switched to what he hoped was a military frequency. Any U.S. station, this is Nighthawk 27, downed aircraft crew, requesting immediate extraction, over." Static, more static. Then, "Nighthawk 27, this is Reaper 3-1. We copy. Authenticate Delta 6 Niner Romeo." Bennett's hands were shaking as he gave the authentication codes. "Reaper, we are 4 souls, 1 wounded. Grid coordinates." He rattled off their position as best he could estimate. "Be advised, we are in hostile village. Enemy forces inbound. Request immediate air support and extraction." "Copy, Nighthawk. Air support is wheels up now. Extraction birds in 15 minutes. Can you hold position?" Bennett looked at Mitchell and Anderson, looked at the growing light in the east, heard the sound of vehicles approaching fast from multiple directions. "Negative, Reaper. We'll mark our position with purple smoke. Get here fast." They ran back to Amir's compound. The old doctor had heard the shots, had his family already moving to a hidden cellar he'd built years ago for exactly this kind of situation. His daughter was helping Roberts toward the cellar entrance. "We called for help," Bennett told Amir, "but it's coming with hellfire. You and your family need to get underground and stay there until this is over." Amir nodded, no fear in his eyes. "You go to roof. Best place to defend. I show you." The roof of Amir's compound gave them a commanding view of the village approaches. Bennett positioned Anderson with his M240 covering the north road where most of the Taliban vehicles were approaching. Mitchell took the south, covering the alleyways and side streets where fighters might try to flank them. Bennett kept watch on the east and west, his injured shoulder screaming but functional enough to hold his M4. Roberts was positioned at the roof access, his broken leg propped up, ready to cover their backs. They didn't have to wait long. The Taliban came fast and angry. Pickups full of fighters, motorcycles, men running between buildings like ants swarming from a disturbed nest. The smoke from their earlier contact had given away the general area. Now they were searching, house to house, systematic and determined. From up here, Bennett had a god's eye view of the approaching storm. He counted vehicles, at least 8 pickups, each loaded with 4 to 6 fighters, dozens more on motorcycles and foot. The Taliban were pulling fighters from across the region, converging on this single village. They'd lost men to the Americans, and they wanted blood. "Wait until they're committed," Bennett ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Let them get close. When those helicopters arrive, I want every Taliban fighter in this village focused on us, not watching the sky." The Taliban fighters were methodical and professional. These weren't random insurgents. They were experienced fighters who'd been battling Americans for years. They'd split into teams, each moving through the village in a coordinated search pattern. Bennett could see them using proper tactical movement, covering each other, clearing buildings systematically. They knew what they were doing. 35 fighters visible, Mitchell reported, his voice tight. "Probably more we can't see. This is going to get real ugly, real fast." Bennett watched the Taliban cordon tightening. They were setting up blocking positions on the roads, cutting off escape routes. They were putting men on other rooftops, creating elevated firing positions. They weren't just searching, they were preparing to assault whatever position the Americans were in. Then Bennett heard it, the beautiful, terrifying sound of turbine engines. Looking up past the rising sun, he saw them. Two AH-64 Apache attack helicopters coming in fast and low, their angular profiles unmistakable against the dawn sky. $30 million worth of rotor blades, sensors, weapon systems, and controlled fury. Reaper, this is Nighthawk. We have you visual. Marking position now. Bennett pulled the purple smoke grenade from his vest, yanked the pin, and tossed it onto the street below. Thick purple clouds billowed up, a beacon impossible to miss. Danger close. Repeat, danger close. Taliban all around our position. Nighthawk, Reaper has your position. We're going weapons hot. Keep your heads down and stay low. The Apaches opened up, and the world became fire and thunder. The lead helicopter's nose gun came alive first, a 30mm M230 chain gun that fired 625 rounds per minute. The sound was like the world's angriest buzzsaw, a deep brrrt that you felt in your chest more than heard. Each round was the size of a beer bottle, explosive on impact. Buildings exploded, vehicles disintegrated. The Taliban fighters caught in the open simply ceased to exist. Then came the Hellfires. A GM-114 missiles, laser-guided precision death. The first one hit a pickup truck full of Taliban fighters attempting to position a heavy machine gun. The vehicle simply vanished in a ball of flame, replaced by a smoke cloud and falling debris. The shockwave shattered every window within 50 yards. The second Hellfire hit another vehicle trying to retreat, then another, and another. The Taliban scattered, running for cover, their coordinated assault dissolving into chaos and confusion. But even under fire from attack helicopters, they didn't break. They weren't running away. They were running toward the smoke, toward Bennett's position. Some of them were firing at the Apaches with small arms, a futile gesture that only marked them for death. Others were firing RPGs, trying desperately to bring down the attack helicopters. One rocket streaked past the lead Apache, missing by feet. "Here they come," Mitchell shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the Apache's guns and the explosions tearing through the village. Anderson's M240 opened up, cutting down the first wave of fighters trying to rush the compound. Brass casings rained down on the rooftop. Bennett engaged targets to the west, his M4 barking in controlled bursts. Mitchell covered the south, keeping fighters from flanking them. An RPG round hit the wall below them, showering them with mud and rock. Bennett's ears rang. Another explosion, this one closer. They were bracketing the position, trying to bring down the building. "Blackhawks inbound," Bennett heard through his earpiece. 2 minutes out." 2 minutes might as well be 2 hours. Bennett's ammunition was running low. Anderson was on his last belt. And the Taliban just kept coming, determined to overrun the position. Then, Bennett heard a new sound, the distinctive thump, thump, thump of UH-60 Blackhawks, 2 of them, coming in fast with guns blazing. Door gunners opened up on the Taliban positions, creating a corridor of fire. The helicopters flared hard, landing in the street in a storm of dust and rotor wash. "Go, go, go," Bennett shouted. They grabbed Roberts, litter and all, and hauled him down from the roof. Amir was there, helping, his face streaked with dust and determined. They ran across the courtyard, through the gate, into the street where the Blackhawks sat with rotors turning and guns firing. Anderson and Mitchell loaded Roberts first, then climbed in themselves. Bennett turned back, saw Amir standing in his compound gateway, watching. Their eyes met. "Thank you," Bennett shouted over the roar of the engines. Amir raised one hand in farewell. Then, Bennett was climbing into the Blackhawk, and they were lifting off, the door gunners still hammering away at Taliban fighters. As they climbed into the sky, Bennett looked down at the village, Smoke rose from multiple fires. The Apaches were still working over Taliban positions. And in that compound courtyard, he could see Amir standing there, watching them go, alone, but somehow not afraid. The Black Hawk banked hard, turning southwest toward home. Bennett slumped back against the bulkhead, suddenly aware of every bruise, every cut, every ache. His shoulder was a mass of fire. His head pounded, but they were alive, all four of them. "Sir," Mitchell said over the intercom, "that was the craziest 72 hours of my life." 72 hours? Bennett checked his watch, couldn't believe what he saw. 3 days. They'd been behind enemy lines for 3 days. It had felt like years. Roberts was already being tended to by a flight medic, getting IV fluids and fresh painkillers. Anderson sat with his M240 across his lap, staring out the door at the landscape rushing past below. They looked like hell, but they looked alive. The Black Hawk touched down at Bagram Air Base 40 minutes later. A medical team was waiting, rushing Roberts to surgery. Debriefing officers were there, clipboards ready to document everything that happened. The whole organized chaos of the military machine cranking into action. The same machine that had put them in that helicopter 72 hours ago. The same machine that had pulled them out. But before they separated Bennett for debriefing, he pulled Mitchell and Anderson aside, away from the crowd of officers and medical personnel. "That village," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from shouting over rotor noise and gunfire. "Amir and his family, they saved our lives. They risked everything. We need to make sure they're protected. We can't just leave them there for the Taliban to find." Mitchell nodded, his face grim. "Already thought about that, sir. I'm writing it all up in my report. Names, location, everything. Maybe someone upstairs will give a damn about one Afghan doctor who decided Americans were worth dying for." "They better," Anderson added, his Alabama drawl harder than usual. "That old man had more courage than half the people on this base. Standing there watching us leave, knowing what would happen if the Taliban figured out he helped us." Bennett remembered that moment. Amir standing in the gateway, his hand raised in farewell, no fear in his eyes. Just acceptance. Just dignity. That image would stay with Bennett forever, he knew. One old doctor who'd chosen mercy over safety, humanity over survival. 2 weeks later, Bennett learned that someone had given a damn. He was recovering in a military hospital in Germany, his shoulder rebuilt with pins and screws, when the news came through official channels. Amir and his immediate family, his wife, 2 daughters, 5 grandchildren, had been evacuated from the village by special operations teams within 48 hours of the rescue. They'd been moved to Kabul first, then Germany, and finally to the United States. The paperwork was being expedited. A doctor who'd helped Americans didn't have a long life expectancy in Taliban territory. The Army, to its credit, had decided to take care of its own, even when its own was an elderly Afghan doctor with more courage than sense, and a family that had sheltered enemy soldiers at the risk of their lives. Roberts had come through his surgeries, 3 operations to repair the shattered tibia and fibula. But the bones would heal. He'd walk again, though he'd be medically retired from active duty. When Bennett visited him in the hospital, Roberts was already planning his next steps. Maybe medical school, maybe physician's assistant training. The kid who'd become a combat medic to serve his country was going to keep saving lives, just in a different uniform. Anderson had already returned to duty, back with his unit, back on the flight line. The door gunner couldn't sit still for long. He'd sent Bennett an email, brief, to the point, pure Anderson, saying he'd requested to fly with Bennett's replacement crew. "Someone's got to keep these new guys alive, D," he'd written. "Might as well be me." Mitchell was stateside, being evaluated for promotion in a training assignment. His daughter had turned 3 while he was in Germany recovering. He'd missed her birthday, missed her first day of preschool, missed all the little moments that fathers were supposed to be there for. But he'd come home alive. And that was what mattered. The Black Hawk they'd crashed in had been recovered from the site and examined. The RPG had done massive structural damage. It was a miracle the bird had stayed together long enough for Bennett to partially control the crash. The helicopter was being shipped back to the States, eventually headed for a museum. A testament to American engineering, to how much punishment military equipment could take and still keep its crew alive. But Bennett wasn't thinking about helicopters or medals or after-action reports as he sat in the German hospital, his shoulder healing slowly. He was thinking about that moment in the courtyard, Amir watching them fly away, standing straight despite everything, refusing to bow to fear. That's what courage looked like. That village, he said quietly. Amir and his family, they saved our lives. We need to make sure they're protected. Mitchell nodded. Already thought about that, sir. I'm writing it all up in my report. Maybe someone upstairs will give a damn. 2 weeks later, Bennett learned that someone had given a damn. Amir and his family had been evacuated to Kabul, then to the United States. A doctor who'd helped Americans didn't have a long life expectancy in Taliban territory. The army had decided to take care of its own, even when its own was an elderly Afghan doctor with more courage than sense. Bennett was recovering in a military hospital in Germany when the news came. His shoulder needed surgery, but would heal. Roberts had come through his operation and would walk again, though he'd be medically retired. Anderson had already returned to duty, itching to get back in the fight. Mitchell was stateside, being evaluated for promotion. Their Black Hawk had been recovered from the crash site and examined. The RPG had done massive damage. It was a miracle they'd survived the impact at all. The helicopter was being shipped back to the States, headed for a museum eventually. A testament to how much punishment military equipment could take and keep its crew alive. But Bennett wasn't thinking about helicopters or medals or after-action reports. He was thinking about that moment in the courtyard, Amir watching them fly away, standing straight despite everything, refusing to bow to fear. 58:45. That's what courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right anyway. Amir could have turned them away, should have turned them away for the safety of his family. But he'd opened that gate. He'd risked everything for 4 Americans he'd never met because it was the right thing to do. Where are you watching this from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you've ever witnessed a moment of unexpected courage like this, share your story. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe to Military and Veterans Archives. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and the untold stories of those who serve. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.